At 7:27 in the evening, on February 9th, 2004, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood pulled his vehicle off the road on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. He had just finished his afternoon run, the same loop he drove every weekday, through the sparsely populated stretch of the White Mountains between Haverhill and Bath, a route that rarely offered anything unusual. The temperature outside was dropping fast, already in the low teens Fahrenheit, with the wind coming down off the ridge, and the road in both directions was empty, the way that road is always empty on a Monday evening in February. The only thing that didn't belong was a black Saturn sedan, nose first into a snowbank on the northbound shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in the dark. There was a woman inside. Atwood rolled down his window and called out to her across the road. She looked up. She told him she was fine. She said she had already called for help, that someone was coming. He offered to call the police on the radio in his bus, the kind of offer a person makes when they're not entirely convinced by what they're hearing. She declined. Her voice was calm, flat, the kind of calm that in retrospect Atwood would describe as slightly off, not the calm of someone managing a minor inconvenience, but something harder to name. He drove the short distance to his house on Route 112, walked inside, and dialed 911 himself at approximately 7:46 p.m., because something about the way she had said it, that assurance, that composure, didn't sit right with a man who spent his days reading the faces of people who needed help. The first patrol car arrived 9 minutes later. The car was still there. The snowbank still held the impression of the Saturn's front end, where it had come in at an angle off the right side of the road. The engine, when officers checked it, was cold enough that they could estimate it had been running for some time before being shut off, not idling in those final minutes, actually switched off, which meant a deliberate action by someone who was present and functional after the crash. The hazard lights had been turned on. On the dashboard there were candles. 2 of them partially burned the wax soft. A bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream sat open on the passenger seat. A box of Francia wine was in the back, along with a bottle of Kahlua. A road map of New England, printed on paper the way road maps were in 2004, was unfolded to the upper right corner of the sheet. Northeastern New Hampshire, the White Mountains, the roads north of I-93. There was a piece of material on the windshield that investigators described in initial reports as a cloth rag, though exactly what it was and what it signified has never been definitively established. The woman was gone. In the 21 years since that night, no one has found Maura Murray, not her body, not a credible witness who saw her walking away from that car under her own power and into a building or another vehicle, not a single piece of physical evidence that has been publicly confirmed to explain where she went in the 9 minutes between Butch Atwood pulling his bus forward and the first officer stepping out onto the shoulder of Route 112. The case is listed as an open missing persons investigation in the state of New Hampshire. There are no suspects, there are no charges, there is no resolution. To understand how a 21-year-old college student ends up on a remote mountain road in New Hampshire on a Monday evening in February, alone, in a car packed with clothing and personal belongings, with wine and candles and a printed MapQuest route to a place no one knew she was going, you have to go back, not to the accident, not even to that morning. You have to go back to the week before, to a sequence of events that individually look like ordinary life and collectively look like something else entirely. Maura Murray grew up in Hanson, Massachusetts, a small town about 30 miles south of Boston on the South Shore. The kind of place where the high school athletic program is the center of the community's social life, and where a girl who runs cross country well enough to draw attention from recruiters becomes something of a local name. Maura ran cross country and track at Hanson's Whitman-Hanson Regional High School. She was fast enough and disciplined enough to earn a congressional appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, a distinction that requires not just athletic performance, but academic standing, recommendations, and a sustained record of reliability and commitment. She entered West Point in 2001. She was 17 years old. The academy sits above the Hudson River in Orange County, New York, 45 miles north of Manhattan. Its granite buildings and parade grounds designed to convey permanence, hierarchy, and the weight of institutional expectation. The academic pressure is real, the social structure rigid, and the daily schedule almost entirely prescribed. Maura lasted 1 year. The circumstances of her departure have been discussed in detail over the years by her family and by investigators, and they involve, among other things, allegations that were investigated at the academy level and that she later denied. What is confirmed is that she left West Point after her first year, returned to Massachusetts, and eventually enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst as a nursing student. By February 2004, she was a junior, 21 years old, living in a dormitory called Smith House on the UMass campus. Those who knew Maura during her time at UMass describe her in terms that sometimes feel like descriptions of two different people. There was the Maura who was organized and methodical, the one who maintained a meticulous academic schedule, who worked multiple jobs simultaneously to cover her expenses, who called her father Fred every few days without fail from whatever phone was available, who was described by people who knew her casually as composed and self-sufficient. And there was the Maura who was carrying something she didn't talk about openly, academic pressure that had been building through a difficult semester, questions about her relationship with her boyfriend Billy Rausch, who was stationed with the Army at Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma, and something else, something that the people who knew her best have consistently struggled to characterize precisely. Billy Rausch. He and Maura had been together for several years by February 2004. He was 22 years old, stationed hundreds of miles away, and by his own account their relationship was under the kind of strain that long distance imposes, not broken but stretched. They spoke regularly by phone. On the evening of February 9th, 2004, he was the last person confirmed to have spoken to Maura before she disappeared. His phone records placed him in Oklahoma throughout that day. The conversation, by his account, was unremarkable. She had not told him she was driving north. She had not mentioned New Hampshire. The week before the disappearance is where the shape of something starts to emerge, though what shape exactly remains the central disagreement of the case. On Thursday, February 5th, 2004, Maura was driving her father's car, a 1997 Saturn, the same car that would end up in the snowbank 4 days later. Fred Murray, who was visiting the area, had let her borrow it. She was in a parking lot in Hadley, Massachusetts, a small town just west of Amherst, across the Connecticut River, when she backed the Saturn into another vehicle. The damage was minor. She called Fred immediately. The conversation was brief, and by Fred's own description did not involve anger on his part, a fender bender, insurance information exchanged, no one hurt, the kind of thing that happens. The following day, Friday, February 6th, Fred drove down from Connecticut to visit Maura on campus. They spent the day together, walked around Amherst, had dinner at a restaurant, talked the way a father and daughter who are close talk when they see each other. Fred drove back to Connecticut that evening. The visit, by every account, was unremarkable. Nothing was said that day that would have suggested to Fred or to anyone observing them that the next time he would drive to Amherst would be to report his daughter missing. The weekend passed. Then Monday arrived. On the morning of Monday, February 9th, Maura sent emails to her professors at UMass from her campus email account. The messages were brief. The substance of each was the same. There had been a family emergency. She would need to be out of class for approximately a week. She would contact them when she returned. She gave no further detail about the nature of the emergency. No one at UMass, not her professors, not her academic advisor, not her dormitory resident advisor, has been able to identify what family emergency she might have been referring to. Fred Murray, when asked directly in subsequent interviews, said he did not know of any emergency in the family at that time. The emails have never been explained. Later that morning, Maura accessed her bank account at an ATM near the UMass campus and withdrew $380 in cash. This was essentially the entirety of what she had available in the account at that time. She also made an inquiry, using the internet at a campus computer lab, according to the log records that investigators later obtained, about renting a condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire. Bartlett is a small ski resort town in Carroll County, about 2.5 hours north of Amherst by highway. She had apparently found a listing online and contacted the rental agent, or attempted to. She had also run searches for driving distances in Vermont and New Hampshire, and had pulled up a MapQuest route for the drive north. The printed version of that route was found folded in her car at the accident scene. At approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, Maura drove to a liquor store on University Drive in Amherst, a place frequented by UMass students a few minutes from campus. Security camera footage from the store confirmed her presence. She bought a box of Francia wine, a half bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream, and a bottle of Kahlua. The total came to roughly $40. She paid in cash. She returned to her dormitory. What happened in her room between that point and when she left the campus for the last time is known only partially, from the physical evidence investigators documented later. Her room showed signs of careful, deliberate packing, not disruption, not the kind of scatter that suggests panic or haste, but the considered removal of clothing, personal items, toiletries, a laundry basket, her laptop computer. Enough belongings that investigators, when they later cataloged what remained in the room, noted that it did not look like someone packing for a ski weekend. It looked like someone who was planning to be gone for a while. She drove north sometime around 4 p.m. The last confirmed surveillance footage of Maura Murray was captured at a gas station in Haverhill, Massachusetts, a different Haverhill from the New Hampshire town where she would crash, this one in Essex County, near the New Hampshire state line. The footage shows her pulling in, going inside, buying something small, walking back out to the Saturn. She gets into the car. The car pulls away and heads north toward I-93. That is the last time anyone confirmed seeing Maura Murray on a camera. The route she was driving matters, because the geography shapes every theory that follows. Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, locally called Wild Ammonoosuc Road, is not a route anyone takes incidentally. It is a narrow two-lane road that runs east-west through the White Mountains, connecting the Connecticut River Valley near Woodsville with the Franconia Notch area. In February, it carries almost no traffic after dark. The nearest hospital is in Littleton, about 15 miles northeast. The nearest police station is in Woodsville, about 8 miles west. In 2004, cell service on that stretch of road was for practical purposes non-existent. The mountains block signal, the population density is too low to have justified tower infrastructure, and the dead zone is the kind that in that era you simply accepted as part of driving through the back country. The accident, based on the physical evidence, was not catastrophic. The Saturn had drifted off the right side of the road and struck the snowbank at a shallow angle, the kind of collision that happens when a driver's attention lapses for a few seconds on an unfamiliar road at night, or when road conditions are worse than expected, or when something else causes a momentary loss of control. The airbags did not deploy, which puts the impact below the deployment threshold, generally around 15 to 25 miles per hour, for a frontal collision of that era. The front-end damage was significant enough to prevent the car from being driven away, but not severe enough to have caused serious injury to a restrained driver. There was a small amount of blood found at the scene, identified as consistent with a minor facial laceration, the kind of cut that comes from a forehead making contact with a steering wheel at low speed. Not life-threatening, not incapacitating. What the scene showed, aside from the car and its carefully arranged contents, was that someone had walked away from it. Footprints in the snow, this much investigators confirmed in those first hours, led away from the vehicle. The exact direction of those prints, how far they extended before being lost, and whether they led toward the road or toward the tree line, became one of the most contested factual questions in the entire investigation. Early accounts from officers on the scene pointed in slightly different directions. Later statements from investigators described the prints as leading toward the north side of the road, where the terrain drops off into dense forest. The inconsistency between these accounts has fed speculation for 2 decades and has never been fully resolved in any official statement. What everyone who was on Route 112 that night agreed on was the timing. Butch Atwood spoke to Maura at approximately 7:27 p.m. He arrived home and dialed 911 at 7:46. The first officers arrived at approximately 7:55. That 9-minute window is the factual heart of the case, the interval during which everything that came before it leads to nothing that comes after. 9 minutes on a cold, dark 2-lane road in the White Mountains. On foot in winter clothing, a person in reasonable health can cover somewhere between a quarter mile and half a mile in 9 minutes on flat ground. In the terrain adjacent to Route 112, which is not flat, which drops quickly into forested gullies and rises along ridgelines and crosses frozen stream beds, the distance shrinks, but the concealment increases almost immediately. The tree line on the north side of the road is close enough to the shoulder that a person who stepped off the pavement and walked 30 feet would be invisible from a passing vehicle. The search that began the following morning was extensive by any regional standard. New Hampshire Fish and Game officers, Haverhill Police, the New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit, and FBI agents from the Boston Field Office all participated in the initial effort, which ran through mid-February 2004. Cadaver dogs were deployed, trained animals capable of detecting human remains at significant distances, even through snow. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the forest north and south of Route 112. Volunteer searchers on foot covered the trails and logging roads within a 2-mile radius of the crash site. The search covered what investigators estimated to be several square miles of terrain in those first 2 weeks. They found nothing: no body, no piece of clothing, no shoe, no backpack, no wallet, no personal effect that could be connected to Maura Murray. The absence of a discovery in those first 2 weeks, when the physical evidence would have been freshest, when the cadaver dog's capability is at its highest, when the snow cover would have preserved, rather than erased evidence, is one of the elements of this case that has most deeply unsettled investigators and researchers in the years since. It does not rule out death in the forest, but it makes the most straightforward version of that theory. She walked a short distance, collapsed, and died within a mile of the road, harder to maintain with confidence. Fred Murray arrived in New Hampshire within 48 hours of the disappearance. He was 53 years old, a retired Army sergeant, and then a postal worker from Connecticut, a man who, by temperament and by the structure of his life, was not given to passivity in the face of a problem. He drove the roads himself. He walked the shoulders of Route 112 and the logging trails adjacent to it. He visited businesses in Woodsville and Wells River and North Haverhill, showing Maura's photograph, asking questions, leaving contact information. He held press conferences in Haverhill that drew local television cameras and national attention in cycles. A few days of coverage, then silence, then renewed attention when a new lead or a new anniversary brought cameras back. Fred's refusal to accept the investigation's slow drift toward dormancy is, in measurable terms, one of the primary reasons Maura Murray's case remained in public consciousness through the 2000s and into the era of internet true crime communities. Without his sustained presence, it is plausible that the case would have been quietly shelved within a few years of 2004, filed alongside the thousands of adult missing persons cases that receive a fraction of the resources devoted to higher profile investigations. Fred Murray made that harder to do. In the first 2 years after the disappearance, investigators developed several working theories, each of which generated its own complications. The exposure theory held that Maura had left the car in a state of disorientation, from a head injury, from alcohol, from whatever emotional or psychological state had driven her north in the first place, and had walked into the forest without adequate knowledge of the terrain or the conditions, and had died of hypothermia before she could find shelter or make it back to the road. February temperatures in the White Mountains routinely fall below 0 Fahrenheit overnight, sometimes well below. A person without shelter, without the right equipment, in wet or inadequate clothing, can be incapacitated by hypothermia within a few hours and dead within a night. This theory was supported by the absence of a rescue call, by the alcohol in the car, by her apparent refusal of Atwood's help. It was undermined primarily by the search results. Cadaver dogs brought into the immediate area in the first weeks of February 2004 should have been capable of detecting remains within their operational range, and they returned nothing. The abduction theory held that someone had been on Route 112 during that 9-minute window, possibly someone who had been following Maura from earlier in the evening, possibly a local resident who happened to drive past. possibly someone opportunistic who saw a young woman alone beside a disabled car in the dark and made a decision. Several residents of the road and the surrounding area independently mentioned in the days following the disappearance a dark-colored pickup truck that had been observed making multiple slow passes along that stretch of Route 112 in the early evening hours of February 9th. The descriptions varied in their particulars. The color somewhere between dark blue and black, the model uncertain, a single occupant in some accounts and ambiguous in others. Investigators pursued this lead through the late winter and into spring of 2004. The truck was never identified. The driver was never found. The voluntary disappearance theory, the one Maura's family has most consistently and vocally rejected, held that Maura Murray had planned, or at minimum decided, in the hours before February 9th to leave her current life, that the cash withdrawal, the packed dorm room, the emails to her professors citing an emergency that no one could verify, the condo inquiry, the MapQuest directions, and the liquor store stop all pointed to someone making deliberate preparations to go somewhere and not come back. This theory does not require a crime. It requires that Maura stepped out of that car, was picked up by a passing vehicle she had arranged or encountered, and traveled under those circumstances to a new location where she has lived for the past 2 decades, without surfacing in any database, any digital record, any account accessible to investigators or family. The problem with this theory is not that it is internally incoherent. The problem is that it requires a sustained, perfect disappearance extending across more than 20 years of digital infrastructure, no credit history in any traceable name, no medical records, no social media presence, no identification record, no employment record. The internet era that began in earnest around 2006 and accelerated through the 2010s makes truly invisible living almost structurally impossible for an American citizen without sustained expert assistance. And if she had that assistance, a network, a new identity, resources, there is no evidence of any of it in the events of February 9th, 2004, which look, in their particulars, more like a crisis than a plan. In 2006, a woman named Vicky Bly came forward to say that she had been driving on Route 112 on the night of February 9th and had seen a man standing near the Saturn, not a woman, a man, in the period before police arrived. She had not reported it at the time, she said, because she had not understood the significance of what she was seeing. Her account was taken seriously, documented, and investigated by New Hampshire State Police. It did not produce an identification or lead to any named individual. That same year, a resident of Route 112 named John Monahan told investigators that he had seen a figure moving in the tree line near his property in the days following the disappearance. Something that could have been a person or could have been a deer, he acknowledged, but that had seemed, at the time, to move like a person. Search teams returned to the area adjacent to his property. They found nothing that connected to Maura Murray. Between 2007 and 2010, the investigation periodically expanded its geographic scope in response to leads that came in through tip lines, through Fred Murray's own outreach, and through the growing online community that had taken up the case as a kind of crowdsourced research project. Investigators at various points looked at unlocked summer cabins in the forest north of Route 112 at an abandoned farm structure about a mile east of the crash site, at a cluster of seasonal hunting camps on the far side of the ridge. Each led to the same place. The evidence stopped. By 2009, the Maura Murray case had become one of the most thoroughly documented, unsolved missing persons cases in the northeastern United States, in terms of the volume of amateur analysis, the breadth of the tip record, and the number of independent researchers who had spent meaningful portions of their professional or personal time working the case. Podcasts dedicated entire multi-part series to it. Reddit threads on the subreddit dedicated to her case, r/Maura Murray, which still exists, stretched to hundreds of thousands of posts. Books were researched and written. Documentary projects were filmed. Each brought new attention, some new details, occasional new witnesses. None produced the one thing the case still lacks: a definitive answer to what happened after 7:27 p.m. on February 9, 2004. In 2011, a retired New Hampshire law enforcement officer with direct knowledge of the early investigation gave a media interview in which he stated that his working belief, and what he understood to be the working belief of investigators who had been close to the case, was that Maura had died in the forest near Route 112, and that her remains were in terrain that had not been successfully searched. He was careful to frame this as a personal conclusion rather than an official finding. New Hampshire has never publicly closed the case, has never issued a formal conclusion about cause or manner of disappearance, but it was the first time someone with law enforcement credentials and first-hand knowledge had said, on the record, what many observers had come to suspect was the quiet official position. Fred Murray responded publicly. He did not accept the characterization. His objection was not that he had evidence his daughter was alive, he had made no such claim, but that calling the case effectively closed before her remains had been found and before any explanation had been established served the interests of investigators who had run out of productive leads, not the interests of the family or of the truth. The exchange, reported at the time in New Hampshire newspapers and picked up by national outlets, illustrated the tension that had been building for 7 years between the family's refusal to accept a soft conclusion and the institutional pressure to allocate limited resources to cases that might still be solved. In 2017, a journalist named James Renner, who had spent several years investigating the case and had written about it extensively online, published a book that revisited the evidence and raised questions about several people connected to Maura's life, including members of her family. The book generated controversy. Fred Murray disputed several of Renner's characterizations, directly and publicly. The book did not produce new physical evidence. It did return Maura Murray's name to national media coverage for several months, and it prompted a new wave of engagement from researchers and from people who had been following the case for years. That same year, 2017, the New Hampshire Attorney General's Cold Case Unit conducted a review of the available evidence as part of its periodic assessment of long-term, open missing persons cases. The review did not generate new leads. Officials confirmed that the case remained open and active in the official record. They offered no public theory and declined to characterize the likely outcome. In 2019, a search was organized using ground-penetrating radar technology and historical satellite imagery analysis, the kind of methodology that had advanced significantly in the decade since the last major search effort. The target area was a stretch of terrain, approximately 1.5 miles from the crash site that had been identified through a combination of tip analysis and remote sensing. The search returned negative results. Fred Murray died in 2020. He was 69 years old. He had been in declining health for some time. He had spent 16 years, and the organizing energy of his later life trying to find out what happened to his daughter on a mountain road in New Hampshire in the winter of 2004. He never got an answer. The people who knew him in those final years have said consistently that the question was always present, not as obsession exactly, but as something that had become structural to who he was, a thing that would not resolve. His death did not close the case. The case remains open. No one has been charged with anything in connection with Maura Murray's disappearance. The black Saturn that sat in a New Hampshire evidence lot for years was eventually returned to the family. The candles on the dashboard, the open Baileys, the unfolded map, all of it documented in photographs that have circulated online for years and that tell you everything about the physical facts and nothing about what they mean. What is left after 21 years is a series of facts that resist the most satisfying explanations in ways that are precise and reproducible, not vague. If Maura died of exposure in the forest near Route 112, her remains have evaded more than 2 decades of searching, including cadaver dogs deployed within days of the disappearance, aerial surveys, ground teams, and ground-penetrating radar. That is possible. The White Mountain terrain is uneven, steep, and deeply forested, and decomposition in those conditions over the seasons can scatter and disperse remains in ways that make eventual discovery uncertain. But it is difficult to reconcile with the intensity of the search in the first 2 weeks, when the physical evidence would have been at its most detectable. If Maura got into a vehicle in that 9-minute window with someone who then harmed her, that person has not been identified, charged, confronted with credible evidence, or publicly linked to the case in 21 years. The dark truck seen on Route 112 that evening, mentioned by multiple witnesses independently, was never found. The driver was never identified. In 21 years, that silence, maintained across an era of increasingly sophisticated forensic and digital investigative tools, is its own category of data point. If Maura chose to disappear and has been living somewhere under another identity for 21 years, she has done so without a single confirmed contact with her family, without any financial or digital trail that investigators or private researchers have been able to follow, and without the kind of accidental surfacing, a medical emergency, a traffic stop, a background check, a social media account that makes sustained identity concealment in the digital era structurally very difficult to maintain indefinitely. None of these explanations is impossible. None of them is proven. Each one has a version that accounts for the known evidence and a version that is contradicted by it. That is the condition the case has been in since the spring of 2004, and it is the condition it remains in now. The questions that have accumulated over 2 decades do not close each other. Why did she tell her professors it was a family emergency when her father said there was no emergency? Why did she pack her room as if leaving for more than a weekend, if she was driving to a ski condo in Bartlett for a few days? Why did she take Route 112 through Haverhill rather than the faster, more direct highways north? Why did she decline Butch Atwood's offer of help with such specific composure, not flustered, not upset, just firmly insistent that everything was under control that a stranger noticed it was wrong? Why were there candles on the dashboard of a car driven in February in New Hampshire? Why did she shut the engine off after the crash? Each of these questions has been asked thousands of times in court documents and police reports and podcast episodes and online forums and books and television segments. None of them has been answered in a way that makes the others resolve. They remain parallel, open, each one a thread that leads to a place in the evidence where the record simply stops. Route 112 still runs through Haverhill, New Hampshire. It still narrows as it enters the White Mountains. In February, it still carries almost no traffic after dark. The tree line on the north side of the road is still close to the shoulder, still dense, still dropping steeply into forested terrain, where the light from a passing car doesn't reach. Occasionally, someone who knows the story of what happened there on the night of February 9th, 2004 pulls over and gets out and looks at that tree line and tries to understand what there was in those 9 minutes, in that cold, in that specific dark that no one has been able to find in 21 years of looking. The tree line doesn't offer anything back. Maura Murray was 21 years old. She grew up in Hanson, Massachusetts. She ran cross-country in high school fast enough to earn a place at West Point. She transferred to UMass and was studying nursing. She called her father every few days. She had dark eyes and brown hair and worked multiple jobs and carried something she didn't talk about easily. On February 9th, 2004, she packed her car, withdrew her money, bought wine, drove north on a cold evening through terrain she didn't know well, hit a snowbank on a quiet mountain road in the White Mountains, told a kind stranger that everything was fine, and walked out of the factual record of her own life. 21 years later, whatever came next exists in a category. The case has never left. The things we do not know, which is, in a case that has never offered anything else, its own kind of answer. If this one stayed with you, the kind of case with no clean ending, only questions that compound on each other, there is another one on this channel. Investigators spent nearly as long chasing a name they already had in the file. It is waiting for you next.